Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling something pretty important for anyone who's interested in Indian civics, and that is the amendment process
Ooh.
of the Indian Constitution. So basically we're going to be looking at how this super important document can be changed and updated over
Right.
time. And don't worry, we're going to keep things pretty accessible. So whether you're just starting your, UPSC journey or just curious about Indian democracy,
Absolutely.
this is the place to be.
Yeah, it's like we're giving you the user manual for how to change the rules of the game, right?
It really is.
Like how do we update this thing? And I think understanding this process is crucial. Not just if you want to be a civil servant, but any informed citizen should know kind of how this document can adapt and evolve over time.
And one of the things that really struck me when I was looking into this is that the Indian Constitution isn't completely rigid, like, say, the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
But it's not a free-for-all like the UK system.
Yeah. What's fascinating is that the framers of the Constitution, they wanted something in between. They wanted to balance adaptability with protecting these core principles, right? So they wanted something that could change with the needs of a newly independent nation, but something that would also, safeguard these ideas of justice, equality, democracy that are at the heart of the document.
So it's not too rigid, not too flexible.
Exactly. Some people even call it the Goldilocks Constitution.
I love it, the Goldilocks Constitution.
Yeah.
So what are the advantages and the challenges of trying to strike this balance?
Well, the flexibility allows the Constitution to kind of, adapt to new challenges and evolving values, right? Imagine if we couldn't change the Constitution to deal with something like environmental protection.
Oh, yeah.
Or technological advancements that we couldn't even imagine back then.
Right.
It would be outdated right away.
So it helps keep the Constitution relevant in a rapidly changing world.
Exactly.
But then how does it also make sure that the core principles are compromised?
So that's where the safeguards come in, right? The amendment process, it's designed with all these checks and balances to make sure that any changes are very carefully thought out and that they have a lot of support. It's not an easy process, and that's on purpose.
Right.
So that, prevents it from being changed just on a whim or to serve just very narrow interests.
So it's like a carefully calibrated mechanism.
Yeah.
Where it's we want to make sure that changes can happen.
Yes.
But we also want to be really careful
about
what those changes are.
It's all about balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does it actually work in practice? Where do we even begin?
Well, it all starts with Article 368. That's the heart of the amendment process.
Okay.
It outlines what the parliament can do, how many, what steps are involved. Think of it like the engine room for the Constitution.
Article 368, got it.
Yeah.
So who can propose an amendment? Is it a free-for-all? Can anyone just jump in and be hey, I want to change this?
Not quite. It all starts with the parliament.
Oh.
Any change to the Constitution has to begin with a bill that's introduced in either the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha.
So even if a state government really feels strongly about something,
right,
they can't just directly propose it.
They would have to convince members of the parliament to take up their cause and introduce it for them.
Interesting.
It shows how important the parliament is in this process.
So let's say an amendment bill is introduced in parliament. What happens next?
Then it goes to a vote, but it's not a simple majority that's needed here for an amendment to pass.
Yeah.
It requires something called a special majority.
Special majority. All right. We're going to have to dive into that a little bit more. But before we do, I noticed that, there's no option for a joint session when it comes to amendments. Was that a deliberate choice by the framers?
It seems so. With regular bills, if the two houses disagree, you can have that joint session to kind of work it out. But with amendments, they wanted to make sure there was a really high level of agreement from the beginning. So it prevents one house from just kind of ramming through a change that the other house is really opposed to.
It's about building that consensus from the start.
Exactly.
So tell me more about the special majority.
Okay.
What does that actually mean?
So it means more than half of the total membership of the House and 2/3 of the members who are present and voting have to agree for it to pass. It's a much higher bar than for regular laws.
Yeah, that's a pretty high bar to clear.
It is.
It shows how seriously they took this whole thing. But wait, does this special majority apply to all amendments?
Actually it doesn't. There are 3 different ways that an amendment can be made to the Constitution. Each one has its own set of rules.
3 paths. Okay, this is getting really interesting.
Yeah.
All right, tell me more about these different routes.
Okay, so the first path is the easiest. It's amendment by a simple majority, just like we pass regular laws.
Okay.
And this is usually used for like less critical changes, things that don't touch the basic structure of the Constitution.
So give me some examples, like what kind of things would fall under this category?
Okay, so think about provisions related to like citizenship rules or the number of judges in the Supreme Court or even the language used in Parliament.
Okay.
These are important, but they don't really change the fundamental principles.
Gotcha. So it's like fine-tuning,
Yeah.
making adjustments without changing the whole framework.
Exactly.
Okay. What about the second path, the one that needs the special majority? What kind of changes need that level of agreement?
Now we're talking about the really important stuff. This path is for things like amending fundamental rights
Right.
or directive principles of state policy, the core of the Indian Constitution.
Yeah, you're not messing around with that. That's like
Yeah.
the bedrock.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about the third path? What makes that one unique?
This path is all about protecting India's federal structure, that balance between the central government and the states.
Okay.
So for these amendments, you need not only the special majority in the parliament, but also at least half of the states have to say yes to.
It's like a double check
Yeah.
to make sure everyone's on board with it.
Exactly. I have to ratify it.
Okay, so what kind of amendments would need that kind of two-tiered approval?
So things like how the president is elected, the distribution of powers between the union and the states,
Okay.
or changes to the Supreme Court or high courts.
Gotcha. So anything that touches on the power of the states
Right.
needs that extra layer of approval.
Yep.
That's a really interesting way to make sure that like the center can't just completely change the rules of the game.
Exactly. It protects that balance.
This whole 3-path system, it seems really robust. But I have to ask, hasn't anyone criticized it? I mean, it seems like a lot of hoops to jump through to make any changes.
Yeah, you're right. It is complex, and there are some people who say it gives too much power to the parliament, especially because there's no separate body, like a constitutional convention, to oversee the process. And some people say it's too similar to regular lawmaking,
Okay.
which makes it easier for like political maneuvering and stuff.
And that kind of makes me think about the 42nd Amendment,
Yeah,
which is pretty controversial.
it is.
Was that just purely politically motivated, or were there actually valid arguments for those changes at the time?
Well, it's a complicated issue, right? I mean, a lot of people connect the 42nd Amendment with the emergency and see it as like a power grab.
Right.
But others say some of the changes, like emphasizing social justice and secularism, were actually trying to address societal inequalities and promote unity.
Okay.
But the problem is that the context of the emergency kind of overshadows
How did
all
it?
those arguments.
Yeah, because it was such a, restriction of civil liberties and everything.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, how much of it was
Right.
genuine reform versus just, consolidating power.
Yeah, you have to consider the context.
For sure.
Yeah.
So it seems like even though this process is supposed to be, robust and balanced, it can still be influenced
It can.
by the political climate.
Absolutely.
But I mean, the Constitution has been amended like over 100 times.
It has.
So it must be working on some level, right?
That's a good point. The fact that it's been amended so many times shows that it can adapt.
Right.
It's not stuck in the past.
Yeah.
And the people who support this process say that's proof that it works. They say it's a good balance between being flexible and rigid.
Mm-hmm.
It allows for changes, but it also protects those core principles.
So it's kind of like a classic debate
It is.
where there are good arguments on
Yeah.
both sides.
Absolutely.
Are there any prominent figures people should know about in this debate?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first you have the architects of the Constitution themselves, Jawaharlal Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar. They wanted a balanced approach, right?
Yeah.
They wanted to allow changes, but with safeguards.
Right.
And then you have people like K.C. Ware, who was this renowned constitutional expert.
Yeah.
And he really liked the Indian system. He thought having all these different amendment procedures was a strength
Okay.
because it meant you could be flexible depending on what kind of change you were trying to make.
Different paths for different situations.
Exactly. And then there's Granville Austin, another big scholar.
Right.
And he said that the amending process was one of the most ably conceived aspects of the Constitution.
Wow. High praise.
Yeah, he was impressed.
It seems like the Indian amendment process is all about finding that sweet spot
It is.
between flexibility and rigidity.
Yeah, making sure that the Constitution stays relevant and responsive to what people need, but also protecting those fundamental principles that are at its heart.
And remember, it was designed for a brand new country facing all these challenges.
Exactly.
So it had to be strong enough to last. And it has.